I want to tell you about the last train that left Galveston in September 1900. It was not just any storm. It was the hurricane that would destroy a city thought untouchable, wipe out thousands of lives, and catch everyone completely unprepared. I wasn't there as a child, but I've pieced together the events from survivor accounts, newspaper articles, telegraph logs, and official reports. From what I've gathered, the city seemed ordinary that morning, deceptively calm. The streets were busy with merchants, laborers, and families going about their routines. Horses and wagons rattled along the brick-paved roads. Sailors unloaded cotton bales from ships in the port, and the familiar smells of coal smoke, salt water, and tar filled the air. People were sweating in the humid, late summer heat, and although the clouds were thick and low and the wind felt unusual, most residents assumed it was just another summer storm, nothing more. William Johnson, the engineer of passenger and freight train number 7, was standing by his locomotive at Union Depot. A man of 42 with more than 15 years on the line, Johnson had a habit of checking the sky and wind before departure, reading clouds like others might read a clock. That morning, he frowned at the low, heavy clouds and turned to his assistant, Tom, a 19-year-old boy just starting his first season, saying, "Something's coming. This isn't normal." Tom laughed it off and said it was just rain. The weather reports from Cuba had been delayed, and telegraph warnings didn't reach city authorities in time. Official dispatches insisted there was no immediate danger. Most people went about their business, unaware that the sea they had relied on for centuries would soon turn against them. By midday, the wind had grown noticeably stronger. Waves lapped higher against the piers, and some low-lying streets near the waterfront began to flood slightly. But merchants kept working. Children continued playing along the seawall, and families prepared for a routine Friday evening. The port remained operational, although dock workers exchanged uneasy glances as loose cargo bales shifted with the wind. The weather had the kind of oppressive humidity that made the air feel heavier, pressing against the chest, a weight that city residents noticed instinctively but ignored, convincing themselves it was normal for Galveston. Johnson watched the water from the depot platform, noting that it had begun to creep into the lower streets, and he checked the gauge on the locomotive. Steam hissed from the boiler, coal smoldered unevenly, and he knew the train could only carry so many passengers if a real evacuation became necessary. The sense of urgency built quietly, almost imperceptibly, but Johnson's experience told him this was no ordinary storm. As evening approached, the wind became strong enough to make walking difficult, bending trees and ripping shingles from rooftops. Telegraph lines shivered and some poles fell entirely, isolating portions of the city. Johnson went to Station Master Rice and said plainly that the train needed to move immediately. Rice refused, insisting Johnson could not act without orders. Johnson replied that he would take responsibility if no one else would, knowing full well that inaction could cost lives. By nightfall, residents began arriving at the depot, drawn by rumors and the rising water. People carried children, small bundles, and whatever possessions they could grab. Hundreds of them huddled on the platform under sheets or in the rain, shaking, shouting, trying to secure spots on the train. The wind howled as if alive, rattling doors and windows, while the rain battered the station relentlessly. Johnson and Tom stayed at the locomotive, monitoring the tracks and noting the rising water levels. They understood that if they delayed, the train would be trapped entirely, unable to reach safety. By midnight, the storm had intensified. Floodwaters were inching across streets, and houses near the shore began to fill from the foundations up. Debris floated past, from barrels and crates to small furniture, carried by the early swell of the hurricane. Johnson walked the platform, checking that all passengers who could fit were aboard, guiding some hesitant families into the cars. The children cried quietly, exhausted from waiting, and adults were tense and silent, speaking only to reassure the young. The locomotive's whistle cut through the wind, a harsh and eerie sound that echoed across the city as the first real signs of panic began to set in. The depot itself seemed to shake under the force of the wind, and Johnson knew that the first test of the train's journey would come with the dawn. At 5:30 a.m. on September 7th, the full strength of the hurricane began to make itself felt. Rain fell in sheets, waves rose to more than 6 feet in some areas, and the water in the streets began to rise rapidly. Neighborhoods closest to the shore disappeared under the flood, while families scrambled to reach higher ground or the depot. Telegraph lines were down, cutting off communication to the mainland. Johnson fired up the locomotive and began moving slowly, pushing floating debris aside, aware that every yard gained could mean survival. The first few hundred yards were solid ground, but ahead lay the Galveston Causeway, a 3-kilometer trestle connecting the island to the mainland, already battered by waves. Johnson and Tom coordinated carefully, adjusting the throttle and brakes constantly, making sure the wheels gripped the wet rails. Passengers clung to each other, some kneeling in the cars, others clutching children as the water lapped at their ankles. The train moved like a fragile lifeboat through a churning sea. For hours the hurricane tore through the city. Waves crashed against the depot and the lower streets, destroying homes and tossing loose cargo into the water. Families who could not reach the train shouted for help, and some attempted to run along the tracks, slipping in water and mud. Johnson maintained focus, knowing that any miscalculation could mean derailment and death. The train became more than transport. It was a moving sanctuary, carrying the hopes of those who feared they might never escape. From the locomotive, Johnson saw houses lifted from foundations, roofs torn away, and entire blocks submerged. Each mile was a battle against nature. The roar of the wind, the crash of waves, and the creaking of the trestle underwater created a deafening, continuous cacophony. It was impossible to stop, impossible to wait, impossible to retreat. By late morning, the train reached the part of the causeway slightly above sea level. Waves splashed over the sides, sometimes covering the ties entirely. Johnson's hands were raw from adjusting the throttle and controls, his eyes strained against the driving rain. Passengers huddled together, whispering, praying silently, some fainting from exhaustion. Debris from the city floated past in torrents. Barrels, crates, pieces of furniture, parts of walls, and even sections of fences, striking the train at intervals. Johnson kept the train moving at a delicate balance, fast enough to avoid stalling in water, slow enough to prevent derailment. Every second felt like an eternity. The train became a lifeline not just for those on board, but for the few who were clinging to nearby higher platforms, hoping for rescue. It was hours of concentration, coordination, and sheer willpower, a race against water and time. By afternoon, the train finally reached the mainland. Behind them, the city of Galveston was disappearing beneath water, debris, and destruction. Reports later estimated over 6,000 deaths and the complete obliteration of the waterfront and low-lying neighborhoods. Johnson's decision to move without orders had saved dozens, perhaps hundreds of lives. For the survivors on that train, the event became etched into memory as a single, continuous struggle for survival. Galveston would rebuild over the years, raising streets and constructing a seawall, but the city could never return to its pre-storm form. Those who survived the last train out of Galveston remembered it as the difference between life and death, a testament to decisive action, courage, and the thin margin between human survival and catastrophe. William Johnson and his train became a quiet legend, a symbol of what determination and experience could accomplish against the relentless forces of nature. I can still picture it, even though I wasn't there myself. The morning of September 8th, 1900, when the hurricane reached Galveston with a force no one could have imagined. By dawn, the wind was already howling at more than 120 miles per hour, and the waves had risen higher than anyone had seen in decades. From all accounts, the city felt simultaneously alive and terrified. Families huddled in their homes, some too exhausted to move, others trying desperately to evacuate. Those who had made it to the depot the night before, or climbed aboard the last train out, were clinging to their seats, holding children, wrapping blankets around each other, and listening to the roar outside as if it were some living thing. Water had already begun to creep into streets, carrying barrels, crates, and debris from collapsed docks. Sailboats broke loose and tumbled like toys, smashing into piers or each other. Houses along the waterfront had started to lift from their foundations under the relentless pressure of the storm surge, and families on the first floors were trapped, calling desperately for help that would not come. Johnson and Tom were at the front of the train, adjusting the throttle and brakes with meticulous care. Every foot of track over the Galveston Causeway was a gamble. Each wave that struck the wooden trestle could dislodge a tie or wash a section of track away. They could see only a few feet ahead through the curtain of rain and spray, but every inch counted. The train had become more than transportation. It was a lifeline, a moving island carrying the hopes of hundreds of people. Inside the cars, passengers were silent except for the occasional sob of a child or whispered reassurance from a parent. Some had been on the train since before midnight, and fatigue weighed on everyone. But no one could afford to lose focus. One wrong step or a stalled engine could mean death for all aboard. As the morning wore on, reports from the city behind the train grew more horrifying. Families who had stayed on the island and could not reach the depot were clinging to rooftops or trees, their voices carried by the wind but quickly drowned out by the storm. Entire neighborhoods were disappearing beneath the water, roofs tearing off and floating away. People recalled seeing neighbors swept away in seconds, carried into the water with no hope of survival. Johnson had to navigate not only the water-covered trestle but also floating debris, large timbers, and sections of collapsed buildings. The locomotive's boiler hissed and groaned under strain, the coal burning unevenly, sparks flying into the storm. Each movement required calculation. Too fast, and the train might derail or hit debris. Too slow, and it could be overwhelmed by waves. By mid-morning, the train had reached the point of the causeway most vulnerable to collapse. Here, the water surged violently, often washing over the tracks completely. Johnson and Tom worked in silence, communicating with subtle hand signals and gestures, adjusting speed constantly, checking rails for instability, and watching the water's unpredictable movement. Passengers clutched the sides of the cars or held each other tightly. Some whispered prayers, some were silent, staring at the shifting gray and white blur of storm, water, and debris outside. At this stage, the train was as much a life raft as a locomotive, carrying people out of a city that was being erased hour by hour. The hurricane's wind, already fierce, intensified. Windows shattered on some buildings in the city, sending glass and debris into the flooded streets. Utility poles collapsed, carrying telegraph lines down and cutting off the last communications with the mainland. Survivors describe a relentless, deafening noise, the wind screaming, waves crashing, timbers breaking, and the trestle creaking ominously under the pounding water. Johnson kept the train moving, listening, watching, calculating constantly. The passengers felt the sway of the engine as if it were a ship, each movement sending shudders through the cars. Some older passengers held children tight, murmuring reassurances that they didn't feel themselves believe. Others prayed in silence, clutching small personal items or family photos. Around noon, the storm began to show its full destructive power. Entire blocks along the waterfront disappeared, houses were torn from foundations, and people clung to what they could. Some survivors recalled seeing neighbors washed away in seconds, screaming, disappearing under the water before anyone could reach them. Debris in the streets ranged from furniture to sections of walls, barrels, crates, and even small boats. Johnson's train plowed forward through this, balancing speed and caution, adjusting to the movement of the trestle, the rising water, and the floating hazards. From the cab, he could see the destruction in real time. The city that had bustled the day before was now a chaotic, submerged landscape. Families who had survived the night were now fighting to survive the morning. The train became the sole moving refuge, the only possible route to safety. By early afternoon, water levels had risen to such an extent that even some parts of the higher ground on the causeway were submerged. Johnson carefully calculated the weight and momentum of the train, avoiding deeper pools where the engine could stall or be swept off the tracks. The passengers remained silent, some clutching one another, some speaking only in hushed tones. Children slept or cried softly. Adults whispered comfort, though they feared themselves. The train was a fragile sanctuary moving across a treacherous landscape of wind, water, and debris. Hours passed like days. Each mile gained was a victory against a relentless, indifferent force. From the engine, Johnson could see floating remnants of the city, broken furniture, pieces of homes, fences, and barrels, all carried by the hurricane across the streets. The roar of the wind and the crash of water formed a constant, deafening background. Inside the train, people huddled, exhausted but alive, aware that each yard traveled was survival. Johnson's hands were raw from operating the locomotive. Tom was soaked, his clothes clinging to him, face pale from exposure and fatigue. The train moved steadily, slowly but decisively, each adjustment carefully calculated. Every decision mattered. By late afternoon, the train finally reached stable ground on the mainland. Behind them, the city was being completely submerged. Newspaper reports later estimated over 6,000 deaths and the total destruction of the waterfront and lower neighborhoods. Johnson and his crew had carried hundreds of people to safety, acting without orders but with precision and courage. Survivors described a landscape so transformed it was unrecognizable. Streets and houses gone, trees broken, debris scattered across every block. The hurricane had destroyed lives, livelihoods, and buildings, but the train had preserved life. Johnson and his locomotive became a quiet legend, a symbol of the difference a single decision, skill, and courage could make in the face of overwhelming disaster. For those on board, the train was not just a vehicle, but a lifeline, the narrow margin between life and death in a city erased by water. The morning after the hurricane passed, Galveston was unrecognizable. I've gone through survivor accounts, newspapers, and government reports, and even piecing it together now, it's almost impossible to comprehend the scale of what happened. Streets were still submerged in waist-deep water, carrying debris everywhere. Broken furniture, pieces of houses, barrels, boats, and trees. Some houses had been lifted off their foundations entirely, their walls scattered across the streets. The smell of salt water mixed with mud and decay hung over the city. Bodies were everywhere, many still clinging to whatever remnants of homes or fences had survived the storm. Survivors spoke of floating through streets, trying to grab onto something solid, and hearing the cries of neighbors who would not survive. The death toll was immense, and the horror of that first morning cannot be overstated. The train that had carried hundreds to safety became a central point in the aftermath. Johnson and Tom, exhausted beyond description, immediately helped coordinate rescues. People stranded on rooftops, in trees, and on small patches of high ground were pulled into boats made from debris, rafts fashioned from barrels, and, when possible, the train itself. Volunteers and survivors risked their lives repeatedly, paddling through floodwaters to save those who could not reach the mainland. Hospitals overflowed, and makeshift clinics were established in whatever buildings were still standing, many of them barely safe themselves. Medical staff worked non-stop, treating injuries from flying debris, collapsed structures, and near drownings. Disease was a constant concern. Clean water was scarce, and food had to be rationed carefully. Each day was a battle not just against the elements but against hunger, exposure, and disease. Telegraph operators who survived began restoring lines where possible, sending urgent pleas for supplies and assistance. Messages were often delayed, sometimes taking hours or even days to reach Houston, San Antonio, and other cities willing to help. Relief trains were dispatched with food, blankets, water, medical supplies, and volunteers to assist survivors. Johnson's locomotive and crew, despite being drained of energy, assisted in coordinating these efforts. They helped distribute supplies, provide information to survivors about missing relatives, and organize temporary shelters. Their knowledge of the city and its geography became invaluable when navigating the debris-filled streets. Survivor accounts from those who had remained on the island were harrowing. Many had spent the night of the storm clinging to rooftops, attics, or trees. When they finally reached the mainland, they described walking through streets filled with debris, searching for family members and trying to recover anything they could salvage. Children were among the most vulnerable, often separated from parents in the chaos, crying, frightened, or lost. Elderly residents and the infirm were particularly at risk, many having been trapped in homes that were swept away or damaged beyond recognition. Stories emerged of extraordinary courage: strangers rescuing neighbors, families using overturned furniture as rafts, groups working together to clear paths through the debris. Every account underscored the fragility of life and the suddenness with which it could be taken. The official reports later documented more than 6,000 deaths, making it the deadliest natural disaster in U.S. history at the time. More than 3,600 homes were completely destroyed, along with schools, hospitals, churches, and public buildings. The port, the economic lifeline of the city, was obliterated. Docks, warehouses, and shipping facilities reduced to splinters. Survivors recounted climbing over debris to find water and food, digging through wreckage to recover loved ones, and salvaging anything that could help them survive. The scale of human loss was staggering, yet amid the horror, stories of resilience, ingenuity, and survival emerged. Families shared what little they had, neighbors helped each other, and strangers risked their lives repeatedly to save others. Johnson and his crew were quietly celebrated as heroes, though they sought no fame. By evacuating hundreds on the last train out, they had saved dozens of families. Survivors recalled how his decision to move without orders had made the difference between life and death. The train itself became a symbol, not just of transportation, but of decisive action, skill, and courage amid catastrophe. Johnson continued working on the railroad after the storm, but the experience had changed him. He remained humble, insisting he had only done what was necessary. Yet those who survived remembered him and the train as a lifeline. The city faced an overwhelming task in rebuilding. In the months that followed, streets were raised several feet above their original level, and a massive seawall was constructed to protect against future hurricanes. Galveston's port was eventually restored, but the city would never regain its former status as the preeminent commercial hub it had been. Government agencies, charities, and citizens worked tirelessly to provide food, clothing, shelter, and medical care. Relief included temporary housing, medical treatment, distribution of supplies, and, eventually, financial assistance to rebuild homes and businesses. For the survivors, life after the hurricane was a slow and painful process of reconstruction, mourning, and adaptation. The human toll was immense, but the aftermath also highlighted the best of human endurance and cooperation. Neighbors rescued strangers. Strangers shared what little they had, and communities banded together despite overwhelming loss. Each story, each photograph, each official report painted a picture of a city devastated, but not entirely defeated. Families who lost everything built anew. Children who had survived grew up with the memory of the hurricane, learning lessons about preparedness, courage, and survival. Galveston's identity changed forever. Over time, the city attempted to document the disaster in more detail, collecting photographs, witness statements, and official records to ensure future generations understood the hurricane's magnitude. Relief organizations, both local and national, evaluated the destruction to improve disaster preparedness, signaling a shift in how the United States would respond to natural catastrophes in the future. The hurricane's legacy was not only the destruction it left behind, but also the resilience and organization it inspired. Looking back, it's clear that the last train out of Galveston was not merely a logistical maneuver, but a pivotal act of survival. It represented human skill, quick decision-making, and courage at a moment when the power of nature was absolute. For those aboard, It symbolized life, hope, and the narrow margin between survival and death. For the city, it represented the beginning of a long process of recovery, a story of human determination amid unimaginable loss. Galveston would rebuild, but it would never forget the hurricane, the lives lost, or the courage that saved so many aboard the last train out. The city's transformation, its seawall, raised streets, and renewed infrastructure remain a testament to the lessons learned and the lives spared that September. The memory of the hurricane endures, preserved not just in records and photographs, but in the stories of survivors and the quiet heroism of William Johnson and his crew.